And good evening to you. It is Monday, August the 10th, 85 days until Election Day. Now, analyzing politics can sometimes feel like staring at the clouds and looking for shapes. You and I could be looking at the same cloud, and I'd see a rabbit and you'd see a duck. You could look at the Democratic primaries from this midterm cycle and see a fractured party comprised of an insurgent left wing and a centrist establishment attempting to stave them off. Or you could look at it the way I do, as an energetic voter base telling its political party what it wants. Many progressives have won their primaries, and some have unseated incumbents or establishment-backed candidates. Melat Kiros in Colorado, Abdul El-Sayed in Michigan, Daria Eliza Avila Chevalier in New York. Plenty more Democratic incumbents have held on to their seats. Moderates have won primaries, too. The truth is, what the base wants, you've heard that expression, means different things in different parts of the country. And I think that having that conversation is good. The spirited debate within the Democratic Party is driving their voters to the polls in droves. And having these conversations is energizing Democratic voters across the board. When you take a look at the highest level contested races in some of November's key swing states, take a look at the Democratic enthusiasm. In Michigan, 1.49 million Democrats voted versus 931,000 Republicans in the governor's primary on last Tuesday. North Carolina, 828,000 Democrats voted versus 627,000 Republicans. In Georgia, 1.08 million Democrats, versus nearly 913 Republicans. In Texas, look at this number, Texas, 2.32 million Democrats versus 2.17 million Republicans. In Ohio and Iowa, Republicans narrowly outvoted Democrats, but Republicans outnumber Democrats in both of those states. And by the way, this is not just a phenomenon in swing states and competitive races. A Washington Post analysis of 990 races over 3 cycles across 25 states found that, quote, turnout is rising in Democratic primaries even when they aren't hotly contested, and the nominee has little chance of winning in the general election. In more than 90% of Democratic House primaries held this year, voters cast more ballots than during 2022, when Republicans flipped the House. Now, there's plenty debate as to what this actually means for November. But whatever you want to call this moment for Democrats, an identity crisis, a debate of ideas, a civil war, it's happening with the participation of a large swath of the party's base. It's very hard to say the same thing about the Republican Party, which has been subject to one-man rule for nearly a decade, which brings us to tomorrow. 6 more states will hold their primaries tomorrow: Wisconsin, Minnesota, Connecticut, Vermont, Alabama, and South Carolina. Alabama and South Carolina, however, are special elections. In Wisconsin, the progressive Francesca Hong is expected to win the Democratic primary for governor after several moderate candidates failed to gain momentum. And we will see the conclusion of yet another bruising, expensive Democratic primary. The race to replace the retiring Minnesota Senator Tina Smith features 2 women, Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan and Congresswoman Angie Craig. $20.6 million has been spent on this race by outside groups, making it the second most expensive Democratic Senate primary this cycle, behind Michigan. The vast amount of money, $17 million, is backing Congresswoman Craig. Looming large over this race is the fact that Minnesota has been the epicenter of Trump's mass deportation program and a representation of that program's human toll. During winter's Operation Metro Surge, ICE detained at least 3,700 immigrants in Minnesota, and ICE agents shot and killed 2 protesters of their operation, Renee Good and Alex Preddy. Flanagan has attacked Angie Craig over her vote for the Laken Riley Act, the first bill signed by President Trump this term, which gave ICE broader detention powers. In March, however, Craig said she regretted that vote. Other big issues include a recent welfare fraud scandal, which has rocked the state and led to dozens of convictions, as well as Israel's actions in Gaza. Flanagan has called it a genocide. Craig said at a recent debate that calling it that would not be helpful to bringing us to a 2-state solution. We have asked both candidates to join us, as we typically do before a primary night, and they both agreed. Angie Craig will be interviewed in the next segment. I'll start with Peggy Flanagan, who's backed by the outgoing Senator Tina Smith, fellow Minnesotan Ilhan Omar, and Senator Bernie Sanders. Joining me now is the Lieutenant Governor, Peggy Flanagan of Minnesota. She is a candidate for the Democratic Party primary Senate in Minnesota. Lieutenant Governor Flanagan, thank you for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Why do you believe you are the strongest candidate to keep this Senate seat Democratic?
Well, I'm running to make sure that people can afford the lives they want to live. I'm not taking a dime of corporate PAC money. I want to be beholden only to Minnesotans. And we've been building a tremendous amount of momentum and support across the state. Just this past weekend, we've already knocked on 49,000 doors for Get Out the Vote. And I think the excitement is behind our campaign because, we are supporting things like Medicare for All, getting big money out of our politics, and making sure that we hold Donald Trump and Republicans accountable for the damage, frankly, that they've done to our state. Specifically, as you mentioned in your intro, with ICE, the trauma, the terror and the loss of two Minnesotans. What we need here in Minnesota is a senator who isn't going to vote with Trump more than any other Minnesota Democrat, like my opponent, Congresswoman Angie Craig. We need someone who's going to actually stand up to him, and that's what our campaign is all about.
So you said you've not taken any PAC money. You have got $3.5 million in outside spending. Where's that from?
That spending is some of that is from the Democratic Lieutenant Governors Association. They're a sister committee of the Democratic Party. Their job is to help elect Democratic lieutenant governors. On the other side of the $17 million that's been spent against us so far, we know it's like 6 super PACs, dark money groups that have been stood up. But I can tell you that we do know that crypto bros, AI tech billionaires, the health insurance industry, and AIPAC have spent in this race in support of Congresswoman Craig. Now, because I don't take corporate PAC money, that means we have to hustle a little bit more, but it also means that I'm beholden only to Minnesotans. And frankly, I think the best way to end Citizens United is to demonstrate that we can run and win strong grassroots people-powered campaigns.
Congresswoman Craig thinks one of your biggest vulnerabilities, or your biggest vulnerability, is getting elected in the wake of this fraud scandal that fell to your governor. In a July 27th debate, she said Republicans are going to have a field day with you, and it's my responsibility to warn Democratic primary voters that Republicans are dying to run against you because they believe you have a unique vulnerability on fraud. Your response?
My response to that is that Republicans are running against every Democrat in this race, on that issue, because they are distracting from the fact that we have one of the most corrupt presidents in our nation's history. But I think the thing that has galvanized people in Minnesota and Congresswoman Craig's biggest vulnerability is the fact that she was the only Minnesota Democrat to vote for Donald Trump's immigration bill. She stood by that vote for 14 months, including when ICE was terrorizing our neighbors and after Alex Preddy and Renee Good were killed. She only said that she regretted that vote. She did not apologize, but she said she regretted that vote when it became, politically impossible for her to stand by it. So I think that we can have leaders who do what's right, who stand with the immigrant community, who stand up for the Constitution and for due process all of the time, not just when it's politically expedient. And that is what we have seen. We've seen the organizing work that happened during Operation Metro Surge to stand up for our neighbors. That has now been activated for folks who are showing up, knocking on doors, and making sure that folks are showing up in this election to demonstrate that we are not going to send a Democrat who votes with Donald Trump or who's nibbling around the edges. We're going to send a real fighter to Washington, D.C. And I think that's why we'll be victorious tomorrow.
The Israel-Gaza situation is not as prominent in Minnesota as it was in Michigan last week, but it's still there. You've described Israel's actions in Gaza as a genocide. Angie Craig does not. I'm not as interested in debating that as I am in saying this has become a real point of tension amongst Democrats. What's your sense of how Democrats move forward into November with the overhang of this particular discussion about Israel and military funding to Israel?
Well, what I'm hearing is not just from Democrats, but from Minnesotans and from folks on, all sides of the aisle, that the fact that we continue to send American taxpayer dollars to, bomb people is not what people are interested in. I think those dollars should be spent here on infrastructure and healthcare and public education. But what I do think is really important. I'm a mom. I'm the former executive director of Children's Defense Fund Minnesota, a child advocate. I don't know how you can read the report that came out from the UN this summer at the end of June that talked about the targeting of children and not call it a genocide. AIPAC has their candidate in this race. It is Congresswoman Angie Craig. They have held over a dozen fundraisers for her this cycle, including one hosted by the president of AIPAC. I think that, I am clear. I don't want to support any additional funding. And just a couple of weeks ago, Congresswoman Craig, again, was the only Minnesota Democrat to vote to send $3.3 billion to Benjamin Netanyahu. I think Minnesotans are ready for someone who is going to insist that there should be no more blank checks to Netanyahu, and that our taxpayer dollars should be supporting the things that we need here in Minnesota and in this country. And I think she's out of step with where the majority of Americans are in this moment.
So I've described these races as enthusiastic. I tend to be a glass half full guy about these things. It's been bruising. It hasn't been as bruising as Michigan, but it's been bruising. I did get a commitment from the Michigan candidates when talking to them that once this was over, they would endorse the winning candidate. Will you do that if Angie Craig wins?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think, we can have a healthy debate and we can talk about the future of our party and who we want to send to Washington, D.C. But I can tell you, I am crystal clear that we do not need to send a yes, sir, Mr. President, senator to Washington from Minnesota. I think our opponent in the fall will be Michelle Tafoya, who, when asked what people should do when it comes to the rising costs of gas, she said, keep a stiff upper lip and, take one less trip to Starbucks. I think that is completely naive and disconnected from what people are facing right now. So regardless of the outcome, we will be unified. I will support my opponent if she is victorious tomorrow, because beating the Republican in this race, keeping the seat blue, that is the priority.
Well, we appreciate the time you've taken with us this evening. Minnesota Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan is a candidate for the Democratic primary for Senate in Minnesota. Thank you for your time tonight.
Thanks, Allie.